History records the death of Salvador Allende as a political tragedy, but looking back, it resembles something far colder. The world's first violent corporate liquidation of a sovereign state. The morning of September 11, 1973, did not break with the silence of peace, but with the roar of British-made Hawker Hunter jets diving over Santiago, as rockets slammed into the neoclassical pillars of La Moneda, engulfing the presidential palace in black smoke. The world witnessed a jarring visual paradox. On the surface, the narrative was meticulously crafted before the first shot was fired. To the Western media and the terrified middle classes of Santiago, this bombardment was presented as a necessary salvation. The tanks rolling through the streets were depicted not as oppressors, but as surgical instruments cutting out a cancer. The prevailing headline was fear. Salvador Allende was allegedly dragging Chile toward becoming a second Cuba, a Soviet satellite in the Western Hemisphere. The coup, therefore, was sold as a desperate rescue mission to save democracy from itself. But beneath the smoke and the propaganda lay a terrifying, silent reality. This was no rescue. It was a laboratory experiment, the single bloodiest socio-economic test of the 20th century. Chile was not a failing state being put out of its misery. It was the longest-standing democracy in South America, and it was being executed precisely because it was not failing. Allende's crime was not incompetence, it was innovation. He was pioneering the third way, a democratic path to socialism that rejected both American capitalism and Soviet totalitarianism. He was attempting to prove that a nation could control its own resources while maintaining political freedom. This possibility terrified the global order more than any nuclear warhead. If Allende succeeded, he would shatter the binary logic of the Cold War. Therefore, the events of 1973 cannot be categorized simply as a military coup. In modern terms, it was a hostile takeover on a national scale. The military junta acted as the enforcement arm, but the objective was pure resource extraction. In the hours following Allende's death, the Chilean flag didn't just change hands. The nation's sovereignty was liquidated. The political will of the people was violently traded for absolute subservience within the global supply chain, turning a proud republic into a subsidiary asset, open for business at any cost. Salvador Allende stepped onto the geopolitical chessboard wearing a straitjacket, woven by his own principles. He was caught in the trap of legitimacy, attempting the impossible. A socialist revolution executed through the polite machinery of bourgeois democracy. He refused to dissolve Congress or suspend the Constitution, believing he could vote inequality out of existence. This was his fatal asymmetry. Allende possessed enough power to terrify the Chilean aristocracy and foreign investors, but he lacked or refused to seize the absolute authority required to suppress their inevitable backlash. He was paralyzed by polarization, sandwiched between a working class demanding faster nationalization and a middle class petrified of losing their property. While Santiago fractured, the House in Washington began to calculate the odds. For Henry Kissinger, the danger was not that Chile would become a Soviet military base. The nightmare was that Chile might become a successful business model. If Allende's third way flourished, it would prove that socialism could coexist with civil liberties. This contagion threatened to spread not just through Latin America, but into the heart of NATO, emboldening socialist parties in Italy and France. Behind the curtain of statecraft stood the true architects of the intervention, the corporate titans. ITT, Anaconda, and Kennecott Copper saw their assets at risk, and through figures like PepsiCo's Donald Kendall, they placed direct, suffocating pressure on President Nixon. The weapon of choice was not yet the gun, but the ledger. Chile's economy was hemorrhaging, suffering from a terminal dependency. 80% of the nation's foreign income relied on copper, yet the U.S. controlled the international pricing and, more cynically, the supply of spare parts required to keep the mining machinery running. Combined with the highest per capita foreign debt in the world, Chile was on life support. Washington held the oxygen valve. They didn't need to invade immediately. They simply had to cut the credit lines, block the spare parts, and wait for the economy to asphyxiate. The war for Chile's sovereignty was not fought on a battlefield, but on a balance sheet. The catalyst was the nationalization of copper, a move Allende executed with a lawyer's precision rather than a revolutionary's rage. He didn't just seize the assets of American giants like Anaconda and Kennecott, he audited them. By calculating the excess profits these corporations had extracted over decades, Allende concluded that the companies actually owed Chile money. The compensation for the seizure was set to zero. Washington's retaliation was swift, silent, and mechanical. The U.S. did not need to deploy Marines to retake the mines. They simply weaponized logistics. The massive mining infrastructure was American-made, and suddenly, the supply chain vanished. The copper industry, the engine of the nation, began to grind to a halt, not for a lack of labor, but for the lack of specific, standard-issue American screws and ball bearings. While the mines rusted, President Nixon issued the infamous directive that would define the era: make the economy scream. The invisible blockade descended like an iron curtain. The World Bank, the IMF, and the Exim Bank simultaneously shut their doors, cutting off all credit to a nation drowning in debt. To ensure the paralysis was total, the CIA funneled covert funds into the opposition newspaper El Mercurio to sow panic, while bankrolling a devastating truckers' strike. This wasn't just a labor dispute, it was a logistics siege that severed the country's arteries, stopping the flow of food and fuel. Yet, the greatest tragedy was not the loss of copper, but the murder of the future. Unknown to most, Allende'S Chile was building Project Cybersyn, a futuristic proto-internet system designed to manage the economy in real time. From a Star Trek-like operations room, the government hoped to use cybernetics to bypass Western markets and optimize production democratically. It was a bold attempt to leapfrog from a raw material colony to a tech-driven power. When the military stormed the palace, they didn't just burn books, they smashed the Cybersyn operations room with rifle butts. In that violent act of vandalism, Chile was stripped of its potential to be a pioneer of the information age and was forcibly reset to its colonial default, a submissive exporter of raw rocks, its ambition crushed under the weight of the global order. The smoke over La Moneda had barely cleared when the true nature of the conquest revealed itself. The most dangerous weapon deployed in September 1973 was not a tank or a Hawker Hunter jet, but a heavy typed manuscript known simply as El Ladrillo, the brick. While the military was busy purging the streets, a group of young economists known as the Chicago Boys, Chileans trained at the University of Chicago under the tutelage of Milton Friedman, stepped out of the shadows. They had finished drafting their economic manifesto weeks before the coup took place. This was the masterstroke of the operation. The military provided the brute force to clear the slate, but the Chicago Boys provided the new operating system. Chile became the world's first laboratory for neoliberalism. Almost overnight, the country underwent a radical shock therapy. The complex social web Allende had tried to weave was slashed. State-owned enterprises were auctioned off to private cronies, tariffs were obliterated, and prices were left to float in the ruthless currents of the free market. The structural trap was set. The economy was no longer designed to serve the citizen, but to service the debt and the foreign investor. But a hostile takeover cannot succeed without a collaborative workforce. To dismantle democracy, the architects of the coup had to weaponize the middle class. Through a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare, the opposition exploited the petit bourgeois fear of losing status and property. The scarcity that plagued Allende's final year was largely manufactured. Shopkeepers and distributors, funded by the opposition, engaged in massive hoarding. hiding basic goods to induce panic. This artificial famine drove the famous March of the Empty Pots, where furious housewives banged cookware in the streets. These protests were the perfect optics for the coup plotters. They successfully converted economic anxiety into political rage, tricking the middle class into demanding the very authoritarianism that would eventually silence them. The end arrived not with a whimper, but with a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. The trigger for the final collapse was pulled by the very hand Salvador Allende had reached out to for protection. In a tragic miscalculation of character, Allende had appointed General Augusto Pinochet as commander-in-chief just weeks prior, believing him to be a constitutional soldier, a man of law, not politics. Allende believed he had secured the loyalty of the army. In reality, he had handed the keys of the republic to his executioner. This betrayal from the very core of the state's monopoly on violence was the fatal blow from which no recovery was possible. With the stage set, the shock doctrine was unleashed in a terrifying cascade of dominoes, designed to overwhelm the senses of the nation. First came the military shock. The bombing of La Moneda was tactically unnecessary. The tanks on the ground had already won, but psychologically essential. The sight of the presidential palace, the sacred heart of Chilean democracy, engulfed in flames was a message of absolute crushing dominance. It told the populace that the old world was not just defeated, it was incinerated. This was immediately followed by the social shock. Within hours, the National Stadium, a place of public joy, was converted into a grim concentration camp. Thousands of students, union leaders, and artists were rounded up, tortured, and disappeared. This was not random cruelty. It was a calculated mechanism of control. By inflicting immediate visceral trauma, the regime aimed to paralyze resistance through terror. The population was too busy fearing for their lives to defend their democracy. It was in this vacuum of paralyzed silence that the economic shock was administered. While the country was reeling from the smoke of the palace and the screams from the stadium, the radical policies of the brick were signed into law. There were no debates in Congress, no strikes by unions, and no editorials in the papers. The trauma of the coup had cleared the board completely, allowing the neoliberal experiment to be installed without a single voice raised in opposition. The shock was total. The collapse was complete. As the smoke cleared over Santiago, the global accountants arrived to perform the final audit of the hostile takeover. The ledger was stark. The clear winners were the multinational corporations, who regained their unrestricted access to Chile's veins of copper, and the Chilean financial elite, Sistinchok Ryantayan Chilean souls, who feasted on the carcass of the state. The Chicago School had successfully proved their hypothesis, turning a living nation into a sterile monument to market efficiency. On the debit side lay the Chilean working class, the concept of democracy, and the dream of economic sovereignty for the entire Third World. History, however, is a long accountant. 50 years later, the numbers tell a hauntingly dual story. On the macro level, Chile became the Jaguar of Latin America, boasting the region's highest GDP and best macroeconomic indicators. Yet beneath this glossy veneer, the deep fissures of inequality, baked into the system by the brick, remained. These fissures finally ruptured in the massive riots of 2019, proving that a system built on exclusion is a time bomb that eventually resets itself. But the true legacy of 1973 is not economic. It is a cold lesson in the mechanics of power. Salvador Allende's tragedy revealed a brutal truth. You cannot build true independence on the enemy's infrastructure. Allende attempted to run a socialist software on capitalist hardware. He tried to revolutionize society while the oxygen valves of finance, technology, and logistics remained firmly in the hands of Washington and Wall Street. As long as he did not control the supply chain or the credit lines, his political ideals were defenseless against the reality of leverage. His faith in the Constitution was his political naivety. A fatal error in a world where legal documents burn just as easily as palaces. In the ruthless calculus of geopolitics, the events of 1973 proved that sovereignty is not granted by law. It is secured only by controlling the mechanisms that keep a nation alive. Ultimately, the tragedy of 1973 proves one cold rule. Ideals cannot survive when your adversary controls the supply chain. Sovereignty isn't written in constitutions. It is secured in the ledger. Now that we've audited the world's first neoliberal experiment, which economic history should we decode next? Comment below.